is the host of Created in the Image of God, a series that examines the role of religion in society, from messianic returns to the emotive responses transmitted through our culture. Wade fearlessly addresses reality claims from all directions, objectively exploring their compatibility with Holy Scripture. Joining him is Daniel Sanderson, CEO of Planksip, an international philosophy and cultural media outlet, helping emerging thought leaders with personal branding by co-creating organic content. Tonight's episode, The Philosophy Behind Middletree, with Joseph Atman.
Joseph Atman. Is that how I pronounce your name?
Yeah, you got it.
Perfect. And do you like going by Joe or Joseph?
Most people call me Joe. Yeah, but professionally I go, do the Joseph thing. But if you've known me for a long time, it's Joey. So, but
Joey. Okay, what's
there
more
you go.
Googleable?
I think the Joe Atman is the concise bing bang.
That's what's going to pull up your books and your involvement with one particular organization called Middletree.
Yeah.
We're going to get into that a little bit later in today's episode. But before we do, Joe, I'd like to learn a little bit more about you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'd like to learn a little bit more about. Take me back to the beginning, about when the lights turned on for Joe, and your formative years of how your childhood shaped the man that we see in front of us tonight.
So anytime I'm asked about this, I immediately kind of go to the recollection of I was just the kind of student, the kind of person who really struggled in school, and that influenced me a lot. And I really did try kind of in those formative years, especially like in middle school and then high school, and I tried, and I just didn't connect with a lot of the material, what was happening in school, and just thought that I was, to be honest with you, just not all that intelligent. But I was good at one thing academically, and that was writing. And I got to be in an honors English class. And in my senior year, I got to take a class called A Religious Quest. And the teacher of that class saw something in me, took me under his wing. He brought me out to a college in New York. I grew up in outside of Chicago, and today he and I hold the same degree in the philosophy of religion and theology. So he believed in me. He showed me that there was something within me that was capable, and he enabled me to really just kind of believe in myself, and that sort of set me on the path that I'm walking today.
Role models are really important. Is there a blending between the theology and those early years? Was there any influence in a religious or community that you want to share?
I was raised Roman Catholic. My parents, were Irish and Italian, and so there's a deep Roman Catholic background in both of those traditions, and so going to church every Sunday, CCD, as we called it back in the day, Sunday school. So all of those things played a role in my upbringing. And then, academically, I always say that I found God in a classroom, really, because I really did. I really fell in love with religion and theology, in an academic sense. And it became so important to me and really informed so much of my life and me as a person in an academic sense. And I always say I'm not a traditional theologian. I'm not a traditional academic. I don't have necessarily one particular expertise. But I'm so deeply influenced by so many of the notions within religion, and again, that whole sense of connecting to something larger has always been really, really important to me.
Did you play any sports or anything? I mean, because the academics is really important, but the balanced life, I'd have to say, was it hockey or baseball or soccer or football or all the above? Were you involved in any kind of team sports?
Yep. I played pretty much all the above, but mostly baseball, football.
Mhm.
Growing up, I golfed a little bit. I'm still a terrible golfer. I'm about the same golfer as I always have been. Um, uh, but I played. I loved football growing up. And
Oh, okay.
again, played baseball also. My father was an all-city shortstop in Chicago, which was a big deal. And he was a real big baseball fan. He was my baseball coach all through me growing up, and played through high school, through my junior year of high school, and then decided that I wanted to get a job so I could buy a car, so I could when you're living in rural Illinois, you need transportation. And so I wanted to have all that. So I quit playing sports my junior senior year. But I
Mhm.
coached the girls team, the Powder Puff team,
Powder puff.
football, like flag football league. So that was really fun. So I've always loved football, and people from Chicago, it's like the old Saturday Night Live skit, the Bears, the Bulls.
The Bears, yeah, yeah.
You bleed sports when you're raised Chicagoan, for better or worse. Usually for
Well, you
better.
notice how we kind of got there. I mean, I didn't get Illinois or Chicago at out of you early, right? But see how it just emerged, right?
It always does.
That's roots. Those are
It
hometown.
always
That's
does.
your hometown roots. That's where Joe comes from. Is Illinois.
There
Wow.
it is.
Okay. All right.
Yep. Yep.
Um. Okay. Well. What else can you tell me about this organization that you've been involved with? And also another question: what was your thesis, your PhD thesis, while you were taking your doctorate in
Yep.
theology?
So the organization Middle Tree is something that I founded in 2015. That summer, when again I was kind of waiting around to see if I might do some adjuncting at the very least, if didn't get that tenure track job. It's a unique organization that I can
Let me
talk
pause
at
you there.
length
Let me
about.
pause you
Yep.
there. That's a real you entered a real buzzword there. So it is a tenure track position that you're involved with?
No. I was waiting for a tenure track
Oh, I see. Okay.
position
Okay.
at the time, but I was looking around, and this is after. So it was really easy. I went to Claremont Graduate University for my PhD, and most of all my peers were able to at least adjunct. If you got your degree, or if you're just going to school at Claremont, you got picked up by colleges left and right. There were a
Mhm.
small number of PhD students in our program. I was part of, at the time, the largest class, and I think that there were only 7 of us, I believe, at that time. And
Mhm.
so you were just able to kind of go teach, not wherever, but locally at a lot of the community colleges. Um, and we all had a lot of connections. Our professors really helped us out. I opted not to do that while I was getting my PhD. I had already
Mm.
taught a little bit doing my grad program, my master's program, and all of that. So anyways, but founded Middle Tree because I assumed, I didn't have a whole lot of trades. I didn't have a whole lot of professional skills. I was
No, we're not
basically
going to beat
doing.
you up over that. Let's just get to the good stuff and tell us what was your contribution in terms of the thesis and what lineage did you come from? Like, for example, what was your doctoral advisor? What were they well known for, and how did they mentor you through that growth of academic study in theology? I'd be curious to know about that.
Yeah, one was specifically, well, Dr. Dalforth, who has the Danforth chair, I believe, still at Claremont, at CGU, in the School of Theology there, School of Religion, excuse me. There's a School of Theology and a School of Religion in Claremont, and people they're confused. And as a PhD student, you're part of kind of both, tangentially or otherwise. Dr. Dalforth, Ingolf Dalforth, was the head of that committee, and he was sort of really just a jack of all trades. I had Roland Faber, who was really a postmodernist, and than Philip Clayton, who is really well known for mostly, at least it was, his work in science and religion. And now he's gotten into a lot of environmental studies, and he does all sorts of interesting things. My particular focus was something of a blending. I tried to get away from it because it was exactly what I did with my master's thesis, but it was really a blending of existentialism and Taoism, which are which are concepts that most people are, quasi, or at least the existentialism part, if you're in philosophy, are familiar with. A lot of people don't know about Taoism. It's the simplest of all philosophies and religions, I would argue. But those two kind of helix in some interesting ways, I thought. And I tried to get away from that because that's what I had already done in my master's program, but I always just keep going back to it, and still do, really.
Mm-hmm. Well, the format of the show, for anybody that tunes in on a regular basis, is that we get to know each other, and then we pass the baton on to Wade. Wade comes in after a commercial break, and you guys get to dive a little bit deeper. Here's an analogy of Friedrich Nietzsche. Everybody, I think, has heard of Friedrich Nietzsche. And he used to like climbing mountains, but not any particular mountain. He liked mountains with lakes. He thought that they had eyes, and he liked the deep dives. And of course, that man did. One of the things that I'd like to geek out with you about, if you'd studied existentialism, is that for the audience, there's a bit of a history, and I see existentialism as kind of an attempt to negate the dogmatic aspects of essences. Would you agree with that comment? And if you could explain that, because not everybody's a philosopher or likes to think of the philosophical traditions, so could you comment on essences and existentialism and just kind of bring everybody up with a 101 on that?
Sure. I mean, basically, and there, there's some difference between like the French existentialists, and then Nietzsche never considered himself an existentialist, right? That was not in the lexicon at the time that he was writing. Although most people think of him as sort of almost the founding father of it frequently. But I think what you're referring to is how that the traditional essence of things does not necessarily exist in the eyes of existentialists. We give meaning to things, or life is meaningless, and we instill meaning into things via our own belief system, or via the things that we kind of or the ways in which we interact with things, and we create our own meaning as we sort of go along. Where I think what you're talking about is that, traditionally speaking, there's a meaning to be discovered right within life. And again, this is more of I think more like the French or the continental philosophers or the existentialists' point of how they see this particular happening. But again, we are injecting meaning into not only the mundane things and the small happenings within life, but into life itself, where again, traditionally speaking, usually it's viewed that life is there's a mystery there to be discovered.
Yeah. Okay. That's a great introduction, and I call it the Wade crowbar. Wade has this branded crowbar that he'll probably kind of ease underneath that and kind of try and dig underneath that. I'm sure he'll. So I think part of my job is not just to get to know you a little bit and your upbringing, share that with the audience. I think it's also partly to kind of get Wade going too. So I see him back. He's smiling back there. So usually that's a good sign. But anyways, okay. So here we are, 1:15. We're 1/4 of the way through. The audience should feel really comfortable with you. Joe, you're a really nice guy. I've spoken to you on the air, off the air. Here we are together. We're going to go to a commercial break. I want listeners to just focus on a couple things. putting some comments into the chat. Okay, we've got an expert. We have an academic expert here. Well, you're a little shy on the academic part because we know you're not doing traditional academia and scholarship, but I think you're much more of a boots on the ground academic philosopher, and that I definitely have a lot of respect for. So we're going to go to commercial break. Reminder to everybody in the audience to put the chat, put your comments, your questions into the chat, and we're going to go to commercial break right now. And when we get back, Wade will be back in the studio with Joe. Talk to you later.
In a world where the battle of minds goes unnoticed, one man dared to challenge the very structure of consciousness itself. Joseph Atman proudly presents the first part of his groundbreaking collected work, A Philosophical War. Atman's mission is to expose humanity's most elusive adversary, the structure of its own consciousness. He argues that the modern human condition is plagued by a thought process that inflicts unnecessary suffering. This thought process, like a stealthy enemy, wages war against our nature. Atman's quest is both daring and revolutionary, to overthrow and replace the current prevailing conscious structure. He identifies the enemy within and seeks a more coherent and powerful ally. With digestible bursts of epistemological guerrilla strikes, he pierces the lines of everyday thought patterns. This counteroffensive offers a new perspective, one that challenges the way we perceive reality. Atman asserts that humanity's consciousness has relied too heavily on thought alone. He introduces being with, a relationality that harmonizes humanity with the world around us. But the battle doesn't end there. Atman reinterprets the early chapters of Genesis. He calls for the removal of contemporary notions of God while offering a profound argument for God's existence. Filled with intrigue, simplistic insights, and mystical yet realistic hope, this book is a potential landmark work. A Philosophical War by Joseph Atman. Available at Amazon.
Welcome to the studio, Joe. There is the QR code for those who have mobile devices capable of interpreting that Rorschach test there, the black squiggles, and sending them directly to the place where they can procure this book, which they have just heard about and become so intrigued with that they must now have it. Welcome to the show, Joe. And thank you, Dan, for teeing this up and indeed getting me excited about this discussion. Although it's hard to imagine that I could have been more excited about it after having gotten about 1/3 of the way through, a little over a third of the way through, the book that we just advertised. Thank you, Joe, for sending me that copy. Actually, we have several copies so that those of you who want to put your comments in the chat to try to get a free copy of it and not have to use that QR code are encouraged to do so. So, Joe, at the end there, Dan talked about existentialism and that you had looked at the helix of existentialism and Taoism. What would you say your personal do you lean towards a particular philosophical school of thought that the audience might be familiar with?
Yeah, it'd probably be existentialism. I never really resonated with the traditional, again, those continental philosophers. I'm maybe more of a Platonist. There's a lot in that book, A Philosophical War, that a lot of people might point back to and say, you're talking about Platonism. Basically, or a reimagined version of it. I was always kind of bored with the sort of those more traditional the Humes and the Locks and those guys who, I mean, I had to, you had to, going through school, you have to learn about all of them, right?
For the audience, right before the show in the studio, I was confessing to having slogged through some of those works 20, 30 years ago, Locke in particular, right? But so some of the concepts in your book, I was at least somewhat familiar with, not that you're addressing it in remotely the same way, but nonetheless, their work is indeed important. Would you agree that?
Yeah, understand, because it gives you a structure, right? And I think that those philosophical kind of giants that we've all heard of, and again, or at least even just quasi aware of. They were much more influential, and they continue to be extraordinarily influential on us in all realms of
Whether we
academia,
know it or
thought,
not.
and modern culture. Right? I mean,
Right.
there are so many. I mean, and you could make the argument very as many people have and do that there's no Christianity without Plato, right? So there's a lot to be said. There's no escaping them for sure. But I think I got kind of bored with those. Again, a lot of the giants, because for me, those ideas had already been explored. We've kind of been living out some of those ideas for a long time. And a lot of those you'll see if you really get into them. And I'm not saying don't look at them. Absolutely not. I mean, again, it strikes different people in different ways, but a lot of them are they're a lot of black and white thinking, right? Which was considered, how you did it back in the day. You
Right.
took a stance. It's what it was. This is how it. It just didn't resonate with me as much. And this is where I thought existentialism was so kind of cool. And there's not a lot new things going on in philosophy per se. But existentialism was on sort of the newer end. And I thought, I don't know. It was something that was a little bit more modern and a little bit more something that I felt like I was a participant or could be a participant within. Just given
Dare
how
we say protagonist?
potentially, but again, existentialism, it kind of leaves itself open for participation, where
Right.
where some of the things that the old guard have
But
said,
I would submit that you've become a
right?
protagonist with this book, right? At least
Yeah,
in my mind.
I know. Yeah, I
Okay.
mean,
So now
and I do
jumping into
criticize a lot of that without directly naming names.
so jumping into that, I want to just quickly show one little comment from the chat. Cameron Cowan, he's the director of anthologies for Something or Other Publishing, one of our sponsors. And Cameron is actually the one that introduced us, because you appeared on
Right.
Cameron's
Yep.
show, The Cameron Journal, some time ago. And when Cameron introduced us, I decided to reach out to you and talk to you about whether or not you would be a good fit for this show. And you asked me, Wade, what do you think Middle Tree? Because I was asking you about, philosophy of religion, your degree, blah blah blah. What's your take on the Bible? Are you for it or against it, right? And you said, well, Wade, you do know what the middle tree is, right? And I said, well, maybe you're trying to go down the center of the road. Why not? And you're like, no, it's the what? What is middle tree?
So depending on the version of the text that you read, biblically, there's that tree that lies within the center or the midst or the middle of the garden, right? That middle tree is that tree of knowledge, more or less.
Right. And, fans of this show, of which there are a couple, know that created in the image of God is pulled straight out of the story that has the middle tree in the middle of the story. The tree is, maybe the serpent is the evil, but the tree is maybe evil incarnate in the story. I don't know. Anyway, or is it, right? And so we then began to dive into a discussion on Genesis, which is a long-standing passion. And I got to say, for the sake of the audience, some of whom may, not be so interested in philosophy, because I come from a fundamentalist approach. It was your reverence that I perceived for that story, to use that story as the centerpiece of this book. Centerpiece being, maybe that's not the right word, but the stage and the metaphor through which much of what you had to say was being infused or interpreted. And the way in which you treated that material with respect and used it to unpack the ideas that arose out of it, I was just so impressed in the initial discussion and now in reading that book. So tell us a little bit about where the idea came from, not necessarily to name your company Middle Tree based on that tree, but where the idea came from to use that story as the as the stage or the landscape that you would unpack and interpret in your treatise, A Philosophical War?
It wasn't really the intention, to be honest with you. I felt put in such a box all throughout my academic sort of career, as most, I think, academics, are usually guided by, their professors, their committees, their dissertation committees or whatever. Was made to do sometimes, and made to look at, and frequently for my own benefit and good, made to look at things and think about things that I didn't want, necessarily always want to look at. Right. So A Philosophical War was almost my own revolt. It was the dissertation that I wanted to write. Right. Except that if you'll see that there's not a lot of notes, there's not a lot of references, because it comes right mostly from my own head. Not that there's not, as you mentioned,
It wouldn't
a
have
reverence
stood
for-
muster because it was you imbuing too much with meaning versus you regurgitating things that other people had said and done.
Right. And you and I have talked, outside of, this conversation about how many academics, and this is not a criticism at all, it's just not the way that I operate. Many academics are going to look at other academic work and then and feed off of that. And we all do that to a sense. I mean, all of society, it feeds on what has come before. Every one of us comes, from a tradition, from a heritage, from a culture, from a way by which, the world gives us a narrative about who we are, right? So we all are guilty of that. But a lot of academics really, they're a Nietzsche scholar, or they are an expert on, again, continental philosophy or Aristotle or whatever. I never picked a square like that. And I think of philosophy as something of really an art form, kind of. And I'm something of an artist myself. I'm a musician and I'm a writer, and I really like to be creative. And so I always use philosophy as more of a creative platform, where a lot of people say you got to play by the rules within these philosophical frameworks, and I never wanted to do that. And so that's why I think that a lot of the things that I had to learn about in school, I kind of poo-pooed, and I thought were not boring, but well, in a way, sometimes, or just weren't for me. They didn't hit with me or land with me in the way that they did with some other folks. But not that I didn't, as you mentioned, have reverence for a lot of those traditions, a lot of the things that, because we're all influenced by certain things, whether we like it or not. And I have my influences also, but I've tried to step out and do my own work outside of the frameworks of the things that I've been exposed to. But again, it's not entirely possible all the time, of course. But that the Philosophical War is an attempt to evolve the conversation, to another level. And whether that's a successful attempt or not is, to the discretion of the readers. But
well, I'm certainly impressed by it, and to the degree that your experience here is positive and you want to come back, I would say that we'll definitely have you back to further unpack the book. But what I want to do is talk a little bit. Hang on one sec. What I want to do is talk a little bit about the a concept within the book that it doesn't go right back to the beginning of the book, right? So I don't want to try to sort of walk through the book here. I want to really strongly encourage people to order this book, even if you're not a philosopher, even if you're, or put comments in the chat and whatnot to try to get a free copy of the book. It's actually a relatively thin volume, and anyone with a background in, at all in religion, will find this putting their feet. It's not a dipping of their toes. It's actually wading in fairly deep into philosophical concepts, but in a way that's very accessible, and opens up and unpacks some of these ideas in a way that should be very welcome to people of a religious background, but also very educational and enlightening in an extremely non-threatening way. Because there are certain religions where they've circled the moats, right? They don't want some of the godless ideas and godless philosophies to attack their faith and attack their beliefs and erode their confidence. And if they're not particularly well schooled, there might be a certain bit of fear and trepidation wading into some of those waters. But again, the reverence with which you approach this material is quite astounding. And it has only deepened my faith and my belief and my understanding and my awareness as I've been slowly enjoying the read here. But what I want to get to is not the origin of this concept, but a central concept of your book and of your work is the idea that it is our interpretation of things. Now, these are my words. I'm not using necessarily the language of your book. It is our interpretation of events that becomes layer upon layer, sediment upon sediment of ideas that are not quite right. If you want to get to the moon, but you're 1 degree off, by the time you pass the moon and sail off into outer space, you'll miss it by, I don't know how many, hundreds of thousands of miles by being just 1 degree off. So it's our interpretation of things that is inaccurate and building upon those layers. And I want to reference, by way of analogy, when I was doing my undergrad degree and I did a liberal arts degree, so this broad cross section, which is one of the reasons I was interested in philosophy. But I had a really excellent teacher who just walked us through the various psychological schools of thought and showed us how these ideas had entered into society at certain points. And because psychology and pop psychology, was evolving rather quickly, I could work through the own sedimental layers of my own belief system, because I, like many young American kids, my babysitter was the TV. And these very sophisticated messages, whether it was the advertisements or the shows, wave upon wave upon wave of, building layers of sediment in my head as to how I viewed the world and how I interpreted the world. And when this professor showed me, this is why you think this way, this is why you believe this way, this is where this comes from, this is where that comes from, and you had no idea that your belief system had been structured by these ideas and these other people. You share that and unpack that in just an amazing way. So tell us a little bit about that and why you call this a philosophical war, and what's at stake.
Well, first of all, I really appreciate your sentiment about the work there. I mean, that's a really, really kind thing to say, and it's very humbling. What I'm trying to do with this is, and I think that the way that you put that is really perfect, is sediment upon sediment. We've kind of buried our own consciousness. We've sort of, as you also put it, tried to. We've been a little bit off with our target. It's called a philosophical war because I believe that there's a war raging within our own consciousness, and this actually does harken back to an idea within existentialism, is that human beings are frequently looking for a meaning. We are constantly trying to find some sort of meaning within whatever it is that we're doing within life, within ourselves, right? And yet at the same time,
whether we're in a concentration camp or not, because
sure,
Richard Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which he wrote based on his experiences in a concentration camp, was also another very extremely powerful book.
Yeah. If people don't know Viktor Frankl, that book is a life changer, and a Holocaust survivor who had this profound take on what it is to extrapolate meaning out of the most destitute of circumstances, right? So the war that rages within our own consciousness, and the thing of existentialism, that we create a meaning that as we go along. Those things are kind of foundational to what it is to be a human being. We're, cats, they don't question what it is to be a cat, or what a cat's place in the world. A tree
No,
knows
but
what it's
but
supposed
my
to
cat
do,
does question what it is to be a human being
or
every time, and he
why
doesn't
you are the
like
way
what
you
I
are.
do.
Mine does
Right?
too.
Yeah.
Yeah. But but everything else in this world, everything being, within phenomena, it all seems to very well understand its place, right? Everything understands its relationship to everything else, and to the structure of this life. And yet we seem displaced as human beings. And again, Genesis sort of kind of describes why that happened, right? So a philosophical war is
Although, and we'll get to this as we move through the show, and especially at the end, an appeal to the audience to participate in the creation of this meaning. There are layers upon layers upon layers of interpretations of Genesis that, if we have accepted an interpretation as dogmatic and absolute, we're not going to understand it. It really doesn't matter, because the material is so rich. And this is another thing you bring to your work, the reverence and the unpacking of it. And you're not, from a religious perspective, saying this is the only way to understand it. You're saying this is a way to understand it, and you're interpreting it and some of the symbols. But if you've already adopted a singular dogmatic interpretation of it, there's no way you're going to properly understand it.
Yeah, and that book is not written for one particular, or to be read in one vein or one particular audience. It really is, and I appreciate you pointing out that I tried to make it as digestible as possible. You have to kind of pay homage to a certain tradition when you write in a philosophical context. But there's also a way to do it where you don't sound like, an academic dweeb, or where you're using this highfalutin language that just to show off, right?
Well, you're really trying to talk above the heads of your audience.
Right. And that doesn't serve anybody, right?
Right.
Academics frequently, they say that, sometimes, people on the red carpet dress for people on the red carpet, right? Or what, academics frequently write for academics, where I don't see the point of that.
I'm reminded of a name tag. I think I used it in a blog a few years ago. You know those name tags that you wear at a
Like,
show that
hello,
says
my
what
name
you're doing?
is kind
Yeah.
of,
Instead of that, my name is better than you.
right. I mean, I'll tell you, as bored as I was sometimes in my, continental philosophy classes, I was always all the more so at academic conferences where everybody's trying to one up at one another and show. And I mean, this happens. This is so cancerous within not only really the whole academic system, because and especially the way, and this is a different conversation, but especially the way that we've structured higher academia.
Well, it is and it isn't, because they're the layers of the sediment that they expect you to buy into and believe.
Correct. And also, if you don't, toe the line, and if you don't go by
Right.
the narrative there, you are excommunicated from those communities. But also the different departments within higher academia, they don't really talk anymore.
Right.
It used to be a very interdisciplinary happening, from what I understand, where that just doesn't occur now. And again, if you don't toe the party line, there's no potential. There's not an ounce of possibility.
Peer review isn't really peer review when everybody
Correct.
already agrees
Right.
with you.
Exactly. So then that becomes so anti-academic,
Right.
and this is where we have anti-science taking place, and so many things that aren't real and true. The nature of thought.
And to go
be
off on a slight
exploratory.
tangent on that, I have to share a quote I saw on Facebook here recently. They told me to follow the science, but I couldn't find it. So I followed the money, and there was the science.
There you go. So, and again, this is like an entirely different conversation, but
Right.
but there are hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars infused into the research institutions by corporations who are looking for a very particular result. So there's nothing academic about so much of the quote unquote academic work that we default to today.
Well,
and again,
we're
we were
gonna.
talking before about how influential philosophy used to be, because it was just people thinking, and then that those thoughts influenced others, and they kind of came to a consensus about the way things were, and that was open to reinterpretation. And the PH at the beginning of every PhD means philosophet. So PhD in microbiology, you're a philosophet doctor. PH, big P, little h.
Well, my
big
very
D.
anti-academic dad used to just say, no, it's the PhD stands for piled higher and deeper. I'm
Yeah.
sure you've heard that, but
Yes.
and I'm not saying that's even true. Like I admire the learning and the scholarship, but to your point, about trying to one up each other rather than reach and transform, and to retain that humility that allows one's ivory tower ideas to be tested against the crucible of reality, which must be the reality experienced by people who don't live in ivory towers.
I really like that, Wade, because I think what the mission for all of us should be, of course, to build one another up. But that can't really take place unless you have an open dialogue and an honest one amongst everyone. And there's no possibility of an open dialogue if you are living in an ivory tower, or if you are not going to allow in opposing opinions, viewpoints. And we see that a lot in modern society and on social media and all that stuff.
And so let me segue, because we're going to go to a commercial break here real quick. We'll come back further and unpack this more. But this also happens within every religion, and you don't belabor this point. You make it succinctly and gently, but that as in a quote from Salman Rushdie's new book, Victory City, talking about one of his protagonists. She was a follower of religion in the sense that she despised the followers of other religions. Right? And so within religion, you have that same circling of the wagons. You have that same dogma. The fact that this occurs in academia and in science is denied by academia and science that looks down and thumbs their nose at religion. But this is a human tendency. Absolutely. In any organization, in any society. And I think I've shared the story here about being in Leningrad at the collapse of the Soviet Union and realizing that, those people there lived in this fantasy world of belief, but they were completely convinced that they were right. And lots of people outside could so easily see that they were not right in some of their ideas. The problem is, whatever bubble you are in, you believe you're right, and you cannot see your own error. And religion is almost custom made to create that. And every religion, every single religion, is subject to this same dynamic. You will always find something in your religion that would tend to elevate you to a higher moral place from which you will look down on people of other religions. And I believe your work is a step in the direction of helping with that. And that's the segue to go to the commercial break. We'll come back and let you respond to that. So hold that thought and what you were saying. But this commercial break is featuring the Royal Falcon Press of Something or Other Publishing and its imprint, which seeks to create religious works and contributions in the field of religion that create that dialogue, that create that collaboration between people of different religions, so that even our religious beliefs can be put to peer review. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the Royal Falcon Foundation. Our curriculum and activities inspire and train adolescents through hands-on experiences, fostering growth and empowerment. Through immersive and challenging experiences, we shape young minds to think independently and develop their leadership skills. Our programs foster new friendships and unity, shaping young leaders to tackle real-world challenges with confidence. We believe in equipping the next generation with the skills to become leaders of tomorrow. Join us at the Royal Falcon Foundation and be part of a journey that empowers, unites, and inspires. Visit our website and embrace a world of possibilities today. RoyalFalconFoundation.com.
So that's actually a slightly different ad than the one that I was expecting. But Royal Falcon Foundation is an organization that focuses on programs for young people, as you saw there. And there's a collaboration brewing and developing between Middletree and Royal Falcon Foundation, which we can talk more about now or on another show. But Mike, back over to you, Joe, because I was holding forth a little bit on a number of topics that hopefully were in line with what you were saying, but will also further the discussion.
Well, I mean, to some of your points about that kind of echo chamber that's created within really any sort of culture, any religion, any even fandom. I mean, basically any sort of group that people are a part of. That echo chamber can be really, really useful because it's a location and it's a jump point. But I think that this is supposed to be the point of any organization, any foundation, any system, is that it's supposed to provide a framework, but you're also supposed to, in a way, maybe not necessarily leave it behind, but expand on it, where that just doesn't happen nearly enough. But that's because I think, and I haven't totally unpacked it, and we're thinking about it in real time here, obviously, and talking about it. But I think that part of the reason for that is because of the fact that we're comfortable in a certain place, and that gives us, again, a framework by which to continue to interpret the world, and it gives us an identity, and it helps us form, again, a relationship to the world, and we're comfortable with that relationship. And then once we get older, that's what we know. But really, I think the point of most systems and most organizations, most culture, is really to continue to progress. And it is a great thing that human beings generally tend to do on larger scales, I feel like. But that's frequently because of one or two rogue elements kind of coming in and disrupting it and furthering it, where the majority of folks, I think, tend to stay where they're at and are comforted by that sort of stasis, right? So,
at the macro level, would you say that, and I apologize for asking this question of somebody who grew up as a Roman Catholic, would you say that the Protestant Revolution, if you will, was partly that happening? A desire to have more of an ability to say no to the dogma and allow more interpretation.
Yeah. And I mean, because once you have, power so centralized and localized, right? That's always going to create a problem. And you're going to, at some point or another, whether it's Martin Luther or Martin Luther King, for that matter, somebody's going to knock down the door, or nail a note to it, and change some things. But like I said, it usually is just one or two rogue kind of factors or players that give permission for that evolution to occur. Well, this is how evolution generally, as we understand it, tends to work. You have one mutation of one outlying factor that then tends to evolve the whole happening. So that's but it's something that especially within Protestantism. And then, of course, look at how many different versions of Christianity that there are.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the Bible for a moment, because, excuse me, I see this in the Bible itself. The Genesis is like the seed, right? And when you look at that seed, let's take an acorn. Does an oak tree come from an acorn? I think it does. Let's go with it. So the acorn looks nothing like an oak tree, right? And Genesis is the seed. And you can take Genesis on its own, and you can do what you've done, which is stick with Genesis and then go straight into philosophy and interpret it. Why? Because that seed is so amazing and so powerful. and it's spiritual, and it's metaphor, and it's mystical. We can take that seed that was delivered to humanity in prehistory. Those who would criticize it because there are similarities between Genesis, the Genesis story, and other stories, who's to say that the Genesis story wasn't the progenitor of those other stories? I mean, you can apply textual criticism and come up with reasons. Um, but to me, that sword cuts two ways. You know, there's oral tradition, there's written tradition, whatever. Doesn't really matter. The point is, however long ago that seed was delivered to humankind, the seed is so perfect that with the awareness, the consciousness, the knowledge, the language, the experience of 6,000+ years of recorded history, you can take that same seed and plant it today and have it grow in light of our understanding today. But more importantly, of the point I was making about the Bible, that same seed and the words that are used are unpacked over and over in rich metaphor that is coherent, that is intellectually coherent, that is used in the story of the Tower of Babel, that is used in the story of Noah, that is used in the story of Abraham, that is used in the story of Joseph, that is used by the prophets of Israel, that is then used by Jesus, and that is then used by Paul, and is used by John in the book of Revelation. And then people who read the book of Revelation today continue to unpack it. And people who disbelieve that this book has a divine origin, they don't approach it with the reverence that allows them to see that no human mind or hand could have done this thing, right? So the seed, when it's planted and grows into the oak tree, now you realize what that seed was for, what it was meant to accomplish. And I feel like you're helping us understand what the oak tree of modern life looks like by going back and showing us that, see, all this stuff was genetically encoded in the seed. And I love, love, love that.
It's not necessarily something that I would have articulated, and you've helped me kind of rethink and redefine a lot of my own words and thoughts. You know, as you've sort of unpacked some of the things that you and I have talked about off camera, but also, you know, through the writings and your interpretations of them. But it's such a another perfect analogy, because when I went back and read Genesis, I got an appointment as the interim president for a seminary, and I thought, well, you know, I've looked at, you know, the Bible and many other, you know, the Upanishads, Tao Te Ching, you know, the Quran, you know, all of that, right? But I was like, gosh, and I said before, I found religion in a classroom, so I'd read all that in an academic sense, but I was like, well, I got to go back and really look at this just outside of a classroom. And when I went back and read the Bible, I couldn't get past the first story because, and we really didn't talk about this end of it, but this is really what a philosophical war is about, is that my interpretation of the Genesis story, and the story, particularly the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, is that story is about how we as human beings became conscious, right? And what we did with that consciousness, and given the way that we decided to structure our own consciousness, that is what really got us removed from that garden. Whether you believe in that evangelically, or is that something that you think is just a metaphor, it doesn't really matter.
Well, I just love the way Joni Mitchell phrased it in her song Woodstock. We just have to get ourselves back to the garden. Whatever she meant by that, Adam and Eve locked themselves out of the garden. We haven't talked about the symbolism of the angel with the flaming sword, and we don't need to do that right now. We will, because we'll continue this discussion offline. But you know, I'm at the point in your book where you're explaining, you know, they cast themselves out of the garden by separating themselves from God. They couldn't get back in. They moved from heaven to hell.
Then they did that voluntarily, whether they knew it, that's what they were doing at the time or not, right? That was their choice. They were created in a certain way that they were so linked up.
They didn't sell their soul,
no,
but they corrupted their consciousness with a flawed concept, right? So let's talk for a moment now, going back to some of what you said. and I love this part because many years ago I gave a sermon on doubt. And I said, a doubt can never be answered. You need to put your doubt into words and then go get an answer from God. But you need to go to God for that answer. You won't find it. You won't find an answer to your doubts any other place. Um, whether or not that syncs up totally with the way you've approached this, but you talk about the introduction of doubt by the serpent. I got to share a comment. There are lots of great comments in the chat, by the way. Got to share quickly a comment from earlier on about the snake, and just by way of another view on it, while you're talking, Joe, about the introduction of doubt that the snake caused in his brilliance, as you put it.
Yeah. I mean, again, whether you believe it to be evangelically true or not, that serpent introduced a whole new world to Adam and Eve, right? And given that introduction, their entire being changed. Their entire way that they saw themselves and the world itself, that their relationship to it, it completely and totally changed. They had an idea, they were able to think abstractly all of a sudden. They had ideas about what's the first thing they did. They put a literal physical barrier between themselves and the world. They covered themselves up. They felt shame, which is, again, kind of an abstract idea. But
even prior to that, the serpent's words introduced doubt into Eve's mind, right? And you explain this, and then her wheels started turning once
right.
she doubted that God
doesn't
was
want
good.
you to be like him, right?
Why is he
not?
withholding? It's kind of like when you watch, Survivor, and the people start getting paranoid about who's lying to them, and they stab their best ally in the back.
And actually, I don't know if you're at this part or not. I said that was the moment. It almost didn't matter whether she ate the apple or not. That was the moment.
Exactly.
The fruit. That was the moment that it was corrupted, right? In that very actual happening.
The minute she listened to the serpent. Now, for me, and obviously this is not dogmatic, but again, a sermon I gave many years ago was the dinosaur brain, your reptilian brain stem, right? The reptilian brain stem. So, and I don't know whatever Freud, the id, whatever, but that very much visceral, experiential first emergence of a thought, right? And then if you react on that thought and you don't process that thought properly, it's just a visceral reaction. It's not quite the peace that you've talked about before you have that abstract thought. But once that abstract thought emerges, if you don't yet have the experience and the capability to manage it.
Correct. And that word experience is so crucial, because I'll also argue that what happened was, Adam and Eve had all this knowledge all of a sudden without any experience of it. Normally we gain knowledge via the vehicle of experience, via doing the thing, whatever the thing is, interacting with it, engaging with it in some way. All of a sudden they had all this stuff immediately downloaded onto them. And that is what conception is. You think you know about something, you think you have an idea about something, and you take that idea as the truth. And then you act on that idea as if it is a reality, as if it is the truth, when in fact it is, an abstraction, and at least 1 degree removed from whatever that reality actually is. And so as soon as we, as a humanity, began to structure a consciousness around that modality, that's where we started to, as you said before, build sediment upon sediment, and then started to bury ourselves in abstract thought, in concepts, which I think is really what hinders us as a human being, as human
Yep.
beings.
So I'm going to go off on a tangent now and talk about some things that you and I have not yet talked about. So not sure, what alignment we will or won't have, but this comment by Steve McLean, I think, tees up quite nicely what I'm about to say. Steve says the tree of life is the symbol of free will that makes the human reality dual with good and bad possibilities because humans are created in the image and likeness of God. So, at risk of alienating some of my fundamentalist friends, let me say that I believe in evolution, but I don't believe in an evolution apart from God. I believe that the Creator set in motion the forces. When God said, "Let there be light," and he conceived of light and the mechanisms by which you have light, um, the darkness was chased away with the emergence of light. Darkness doesn't actually exist, it's the absence of light. Light, in that sense, always existed because God said, "Let there be light," at some original primal point. But he set forces in motion in which all of creation since then, some have likened it to an algorithm that just plays out, right? These forces that are in place, which we are discovering through science, through true science, have allowed for the creation of everything and the diversity that unfolds through the interplay of those forces. So just accepting for a moment that, I'll throw out there various theories, plural, of how evolution happens, right? People think evolution is this monolithic thing. You either believe in it or you don't. There's lots of nuance. And one of the theories within evolution is this kind of punctuated evolution, where you have a lot of not change, and then suddenly you have a quick advance here, there, and maybe it's some external force that forces quick change or whatever. But assuming for a moment that these forces play to where things go along, and then at some point you reach critical mass and there's an outburst, and then you also have like an explosion of life in and diversity in the Cambrian period or whatever it is. Would it be fair to say, and maybe we should have Dan weigh in on this when we invite him back in, would it be fair to say that in fact, let's bring him in right now because he's throwing something in the chat. So there you are, Dan. Yes, punctuated equilibrium, Gould. My point being this: would it be fair to say and to position this whole scenario as, in my view, the Creator decides, you know what, now's the time to just give it this little push. And when you talk, Joe, about suddenly there was this download, or whether it was suddenly an eruption, whichever way, it was a sudden burst of consciousness and awareness for which, to your point, we had no experience. It's like a baby coming out of the womb, and suddenly those lungs that were there, that were created for that purpose, have their first influx of air. And the first reaction is a primal scream, right? John Lennon wanted to get back to primal scream therapy. I don't know if it was that first cry from the womb that he was getting to, but yeah, there was no experience. And so fast forward many thousands of years, for those who think that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is evil and was a sinful thing, Paul the apostle contradicts that view. So many people think Paul, the apostle of sin and the horrible person that introduced guilt and all that stuff. Well, actually, Paul said, in talking about the maturity and growth of a Christian, milk is for babes. And he was criticizing the Corinthians, saying, you have need that somebody teach you again. You have need of milk, not meat. Then he said, strong meat, the rich protein that can help you grow, strong meat belongs to those who by reason of use, experience, right? By reason of use have exercised their what? Their senses to do what? To discern what? Good and evil. Strong meat belongs to those who, by reason of use, have exercised their senses to discern good and evil. So when I realized this many years ago, it flips the whole narrative of sin on its head and says, we were always intended to learn to master this newfound capability. What you're proposing, Joseph, in my view, is, hey, grow up, humanity. By now, you should know how to deal with this. And isn't it true that some societies and some religious traditions and some mystics have been practicing what you're now proposing for the Western world already for centuries and millennia, right? In terms of meditation, getting back to that experiential, put your thoughts in the fire, let them just burn away. I've been to some retreats where they try to help you get to that state of conscious being.
It's a
And
great
I'll shut up now because I've said a lot here.
No, and it's all good. And I mean, I know we brought Dan back, so wanted to hear from him, of course, also. But like, there's a great saying in Zen. I really like Zen, as I mentioned. I dabbled in Taoism a little bit. There's a great saying in Zen that says, "There is a field beyond good and evil. I will meet you there." Right. It speaks to a number of different things. But I think that, frequently, we don't know, ourselves, and you never know exactly, what a thing actually is. You can never really term a thing. You can never really come to a judgment on a thing, as a subject, as a subjective human being, or as a subject in general. You really have to have this objective stance, which none of us have, which only, we generally default to a deity with this omniscient, omnipotent perspective, to make these kinds of judgments, or to maybe give us these sorts of pushes that we think, are either, labeled, termed good, bad, knowledge, misinformation, whatever it is. It's all experience. And our brains, our want to, again, this kind of goes back to that echo chamber of culture, of society, of whatever group you're part of. Concepts and ideas are groups themselves, right? And that gives us a location. It gives us a way to navigate through the world. And we term something, again, as good, as evil, as whatever. And that helps us, again, to navigate, to continue on, to have a direction, to have a path, to have a narrative about who we are and how we operate, when the reality is that we're just experiencing things, and we're grappling with those experiences, and we might be better off if we didn't label them as such, had the experience, and let it be what it is, good, bad, or other, right? There's a lot more to say on that, but I'm trying to be concise.
When you mention the word narrative, it immediately brings our modern world to mind because of the narratives. I think so often of quantum particles and their spin, and how everyone today is spinning everything constantly and choosing their narratives. Are narratives just sophisticated modes of using abstract thought to control other small c consciousnesses? Or are they used to be helpful for a dialogue and discussion, right?
Yeah,
and doesn't this get to the heart of cancel culture, when
Sure.
a narrative is spun as dogmatic truth, and anyone who does not agree with the narrative is canceled, versus this is my take on things, what do you think?
And Wade, we were talking off camera earlier about how, and you had come to the realization that everybody thinks they're right, and that, and I think that everybody
thinks they're right. I know I'm right, but everybody else thinks they're right.
But everybody kind of operates, I think, from this point of innocence. in that we're all trying, for the most part, I think, with a very few outliers.
We should assume good intent. We should
Yeah,
assume that they
yeah,
think they're right because they've really thought about this and they think
yeah.
this is the best way.
And you know what? For them, it very well may be, right? And that's where it's like you kind of have to, it's very difficult to do, because for us, that's not the right way, because we're all individuals and we have our unique
But
experience.
isn't it amazing how we go from I need to speak my truth to you need to shut up about your truth?
Right. Well, but again, it's because we're comfortable in our own narratives, and what other people are saying are impinging upon that,
Right.
and that makes us uncomfortable, and that makes us have to question who we are and what our story is, and goes back all the way to that or can go up all the way to the academic institutions, right, that we were talking, or the academic disciplines, or what it is that people have come to build a whole life around. And that can be anything from a career to a religion to a singular idea, much less or much more maybe an idea about who we are, or who that individual is, and that person's relationship to all of society and all of creation itself. Right? We're all trying to find our place within it. And this is what Dan and I were talking about in the intro: is that what existentialism asks you to do is to interpret and give things meaning for yourself. And it's sort of a liberating happening where frequently in traditional modes of thought, we have to live up to something. And we're frequently, and especially this is a Roman Catholic thing, you think that you're not good enough, right? That you're guilty, and that you'll never live up to the person that
You
Jesus
cannot
was,
wash
or
off the
Paul,
original
or
sin.
whomever, right?
You
Right.
cannot wash off the original sin.
Right. And so the beauty
Even
about
Jesus
something,
can't forgive the original sin.
yeah, but he was a part of that too when he decided to become fully human and fully God at the
Absolutely.
same time, right? He wanted to experience that, and this is a whole other conversation too. But this is, I think, one of the beautiful things about Christianity is that no other religion has
And the word
the
became
center.
flesh and dwelt among us.
No other religion has that.
Right.
Their God became a human being to empathize with its own creation, to humble itself
Their
to its own
gods
creation.
their
It's
gods
an
had all the
amazing story.
evil characteristics of human beings, and they were philandering and birthing out of wedlock and killing somebody else's kids, and yeah, it's the opposite, right?
Right, exactly. So I don't know. There's so much to be said, precisely about how we again navigate through this world, and what we think of as our own place within it. And this is where I start to talk about how we have these ideas about who we are, what we should be, and then those ideas come to define us, even if those ideas aren't quite lined up with with the reality of the greater situation. And as again you put it before, as we keep building upon those, and we might be jettisoning off in the wrong direction.
Keep trying to influence other people so that me and all my girlfriends all agree, that you're not dateable, right?
Right.
And that's just one instance, right? And then we have Hitler, who managed to convince lots of his fellow countrymen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So truth doesn't necessarily have to, reside with a capital T. In some instances, we could debate that it does, but I think in a lot of instances, you have to come to your own relationship, your own contract with the world, with the universe, is going to be different than mine, and I think that's okay. But that's a modern view.
No, it's an ancient view, because when Adam and Eve were created, they were created sovereign. Everything was put under them, and David later explains this again. This whole unpacking of the seed. David later explains in the Psalms that everything was put under their feet, and then he explains what was not put under their feet. And as I've explained, and through my trilogy, that it results in the rod of iron. The sovereignty extended right up to the greater and lesser light in heaven, which God put in heaven to rule the night and the day. So ultimately, the whole Genesis story is telling us you have sovereignty on this planet. Each of you is sovereign before me. And if we were to then look at the seed of the word rulership, which was accorded to the sun and the moon to rule us, not to any human being. And then the so-called curse that resulted from eating that fruit was that we enslave each other. Your desire will be to your husband, and he will rule over you. And Adam likewise was enslaved by trying to till the earth that would now fight against him. He was cast into his own version of hell, of having to provide for a woman, in this analogy, who would never be satisfied. And so we enslave each other when we abdicate our sovereignty. But to the degree we submit to the greater and lesser lights in heaven, we can unpack why there's a greater and lesser light another day. But when we submit to the light, we retain our sovereignty, each of us. But when any one of us turns that light off, we succumb to the darkness and we enslave ourselves and we enslave others.
And how do you turn that light off? By, again, entering into your own echo chamber and perseverating or concentrating.
Right. You have to close off the light and not let it enter in, which Correct. Is why, again, to quote my own books, which is why I use Leonard Cohen's anthem and the 3 verses to open each of them, because the chorus is, there is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Right. So this is a great segue to go to commercial break. We're going to shorten it and not do our 4th ad. Sorry for that sponsor, but we're going to do this 3rd one because it's for an anthology from Something or Other Publishing about heaven and hell. And I think it ties in exactly with what we're talking about here and different people's interpretations and what they have to contribute to the dialogue. And I forget the word we used, contribution earlier, but anyway, and then we're going to announce a new anthology coming up here. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. Dan, we're actually going to let you speak. So gather your thoughts and
we'll see.
We will be back soon, right after this word from one of our sponsors. Stay tuned.
The concept of heaven and hell has been a central idea throughout human thought and cultural history. From ancient civilizations to modern religions, people have explored the nature of the afterlife and the potential consequences of their actions during their lifetime. Royal Falcon Press Imprint presents a new project seeking diverse perspectives on the fundamental human theme of heaven and hell. Our goal is to create an anthology that provides readers with a rich and nuanced exploration of heaven and hell throughout human history, inviting writers to draw from a wide range of sources and authors, including religious texts such as the Bible and the Quran, philosophical treatises like Plato's Republic, and modern works like Neil Gaiman's The Sandman series, or Michelle Baum's The 5 People You Meet in Heaven. Scan the QR code to submit your contribution to Heaven and Hell by Wade Franson at supellc.com.
Got to get that fixed. It's not by me. It was my idea to have this particular anthology. Again, here the idea is to get these various contributions, these various perspectives, to have a dialogue from scholars and wannabe scholars, thinkers, religious people, people involved in literature, to try to help us expand our awareness and our understanding of what heaven and hell really are. In the same way, Joe, that you have unpacked the book of Genesis to help us see that the Garden of Eden was heaven, and getting trapped in your hall of mirrors, self-referential echo chamber of abstract thought with all its doubts and insecurities and lies and confusion is in fact hell.
Anytime you are removed from what is, you're living in a state that is of your own creation, and when you get into that place, it can go down a very dark road very quickly. But when you're grounded in something that is not necessarily conceptual, is not abstract, has that tinge, that reality behind it, whatever that thing might be, when when you have something that you can anchor yourself, to, and I think that this is the importance of otherness and of other people and of other happenings beyond yourself and of reality itself, of being itself. When you can anchor yourself to something tenable, tangible, real, and have a relationship and a dialogue with that, that's a healthy way to go.
Well,
I'll just pause there for a moment and hope that Dan jumps in.
Yeah, I could. I want to share something with you guys. This is a man-made land bridge in Tyre from none other than Alexander the Great, who also went by Atman in his years of conquest prior to Jesus, prior to Christianity. There was a man on this planet that viewed himself as very much the way Wade was explaining, that there comes to a point, a pinnacle between light and darkness. And Alexander the Great felt that he was the person on the earth that represented the light. Okay, and this is represented in a 16-point Hellenic star, or the Virginia sun. It's a star from Macedonia. What was really interesting is that during these conquests, he was actually confident of his, unshakable in his confidence about everything in and under the sun, but very much scared of what lurked in the darkness below his feet, and in particular in the waters. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And yeah, wanted to share that with you, especially with Joe, because he's a fellow Atman like Alexander.
I did not know that about Alexander.
Nor did I. That's fascinating.
He had these curls that made him actually look like he went to the Temple of Delphi, and I think they recognized him as that, as a god, and just game over, right? I mean, you can't even imagine that anymore. Someone thinking, somebody totally conquering the world as he did,
Right. Yeah.
So
yeah, you could argue he was potentially the most powerful person, him and maybe like Marcus Aurelius, or so most powerful man ever to live, right?
Well, I think after that point, I think in history we've had maybe something like what Wade's talking about, these punctuated equilibriums. I don't spend a lot of time on Gould's theory. I think science looks very close at something, and there's aspects of things that get dismissed out of Gould's theory. But I think in an abstract sense, I think Wade's got some good points. And we've heard him on the show talk about from ditch to ditch, right? This is that pendulum.
We lurch forward as a nation and as a species from ditch to ditch.
I love that.
Yeah. So,
but so does a sailboat, right? We have to tack into the wind.
Yeah, and so well, I forget what my point on that, but I mean, help me out, guys. We're going to use in real time the spirit of the dialogue to help tease out and pull something from the abyss. Where was I going with that?
Well, you were reaching back to a point in the conversation some time ago, and I'm trying to remember now what it was. I was with
the punctuated equilibriums.
Oh,
yeah,
right, and the idea that what the Garden of Eden represents is the point in time when man had reached, when the progenitor of our species had reached the point of the emergence of consciousness, right? And the rush of drama and stress. It's like Stanley Kubrick's opening scene to 2001: Space Odyssey, right?
Oh yeah,
where
yeah.
There's a black obelisk, and the monkey, the ape, has a bone, and he learns how to use the tool. And the next thing you know, he's killing his fellow monkeys with it.
Yeah. Oh, not only that. I mean, the scene for me is really interesting because there's a reflex mechanism for us to do this, right? And so something, whatever it is, wherever it is, comes from above, and that's in a sense uh, a, um, a biological human interpretation of something that's all powerful and all. I mean, how it's not above, but we still have this bias to thinking that it's up, and heaven is
Well,
up, and
we
it's.
have, we do have a very interesting contribution from the audience here, so I'm going to show this. When you were talking about Alexander and below, Lord Kai said, consider that point in relation to the story of the loaves and fishes. And he asked, I didn't get it. What are you talking about? And this is what he's talking about. The loaves and fishes are multiplied, but they originally came out of the depths of the water, which in the ancient world represented chaos. And in fact, the first words of the book of Genesis, in the what are the very first words? Um, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth, and the earth was tohu vabohu. The earth was without form and void. Uh,
Mm,
the earth was primordial chaos,
mhm.
right? And then the question in some circles was, is that word was or became, right? That's a whole nother Oprah, which I won't get into. Um, but I'd never heard this thought that the loaves and fishes were multiplied, and that they came in the ancient world from the chaos. I've I've looked at this more simplistically and said that pure religion needs to be a whole lot more about giving out more loaves and fishes, rather than, you know, trying to trying to convince people of what it is you're saying. But what
Mm.
are you guys' thoughts to this? The loaves and fishes also came out of the depths of water in the ancient world, representing chaos.
Well, teacher, let me ask. I think this is in the spirit of trying to really look at something. Um, I think I think we can be honest about it. And I'm saying, hey, I'm having a little bit of problem with it. Like the loaves and the fishes are multiplied, okay, and kind of step it through. And this is really attainable for anybody that wants um, to find meaning in literature. Okay, please put it back up. So, Joe, what do you? I mean, how would you approach this when you're looking at deriving the value from this piece here? The loaves and the fishes are multiplied, okay, and then we move into. So, just break down how you approach this comment here.
Well, the original story, if I'm interpreting it and remembering it correctly, is that happened at a wedding, uh, right? I mean, if we're talking about
No,
that,
that
where
was the wine. The wine to water to wine happened at a wedding.
was that
This was a sermon. I don't
the
know that
Sermon
it
on the
was
Mount?
the Sermon on the Mount, but it was
Yeah,
at one of
okay,
Jesus'
Sermon on the
public,
Mount.
one of his public addresses with lots of people there that came to
Right,
hear him.
where they came to hear him speak, and there wasn't enough food for everyone.
And his disciples came to him
So,
and said, "What are we going to do? There are all these
right.
people."
He
And he
said,
says, "Here, take these
don't
loaves
worry.
and fishes and go feed them."
Yeah.
And when they came back, they had more than they started with after feeding everybody.
So my point is that I think we can extract and you can extrapolate all sorts of things from certainly biblical verses, but anything uh, in literature, in art, in story, and relate that to a number of different experiences. Kind of goes back to what we were talking about before about how you can create your own truths. And that does not mean that they are untrue at all. And that's sort of the beauty about it. And I also spoke earlier about how I've always framed my own philosophical work and my own journey within philosophy as something of an art form. And I think that that's kind of the beauty about being able to connect dots that weren't necessarily there before, but it doesn't mean that they're untrue. For that story for me, and I may have gotten the location, mixed up there, or the event, but that story has always been about, for me, being fed by faith and by
Mm,
following the word, right? And that if you come to hear the word, you'll as maybe that's just pure metaphor, and that might be wrong. I had never, connected that dotted line, to something more metaphorical about that, but certainly, and I'm not sure that, not being a historian per se, I could have told you that the depths of the water represented that. But for me, that story, that multiplication of, and as you said, Wade, there was more that existed. There was more food there after it was passed around than people could even eat. That you would be so nourished from following that word.
You could parallel it with the rivers of living water as well that would come out of the belly of.
Yeah.
But here's a further comment. The story is found 6 times in the gospel, meant to parallel the story of the Israel in the wilderness. I'd like to fact check that. I don't know that it was 6 times, but that's not the point. We're not trying to criticize here. We appreciate the contribution, and it brings up an ability to discuss it. I would say that there's a clear parallel in the Old Testament where I'm trying to remember which prophet it was, but there was a widow who had a little jar of oil, right? And I think it was Elijah, and there was a famine in the land, and I think it was Elijah that came to her and asked her to make him some loaf of bread. And she said, my son and I were going to starve. I just have a little oil and a little flour. But she did it, and she used it and to make her last loaf of bread. And then lo and behold, the jar never stopped delivering oil and the flour. And they continued to eat and feed throughout the entire famine. It's kind of like the inverse of this, where you did just enough, but it never ran out. And here you have an abundance, right? But all of these insights are for rich discussion, right? I think that they're interesting and welcome. So I want to share something now, because I would be remiss in this discussion to not bring in a Baha'i concept, given that I'm a Baha'i. And for those Baha'is who are listening, and also for those who are not Baha'is, this idea of unpacking the seed and how the story progresses and evolves over the course of the narrative, even within the Bible. And then if you look elsewhere into the Upanishads, as you've said, in the Quran, and you have these truths and these different discussion points available elsewhere to enrich the discussion. There is a narrative about Adam and Eve that's provided by Abdul Baha, who was the son of Baha'u'llah, who was the person who founded the Baha'i faith in the mid-1800s. And Abdul Baha gave answers to these questions that were asked him by a Christian woman. I believe she was Christian. I don't think she was Jewish, or she had a Christian background. And one of them was about Adam and Eve. And he explains that, look, you might be considered an idiot if you tried to take this story literally. It would be hard to believe that this story literally happened, he said. Now, there are those who do think it literally happened, and I'm not saying it did not. I'm just saying it stretches the credulity, that the animals lined up and were able to be counted and given, or not counted, but given names, similar to the Noah story, right? That the animals just obeyed some mystical command to show up and be named, right? Just to give one example, or a talking serpent, whatever. I'm not saying it didn't literally happen, but the point is he gives an interpretation of it, and he gives an interpretation of what Adam and Eve were. But then he says, look, this is one interpretation. This is one way to look at it. And then he says there are 95 others. And by 95, he means it in the same sense that Jesus said, how many times should I forgive my brother? 70 times 7. He didn't literally mean 490 times, right? The number isn't to be taken literally either, 95 times, 95 ways. He said there are 95 other interpretations, and Baha'is should search them out. The point here is that you should be thinking about this. You should be digging into it. You should be engaging with it. You should be asking questions of it, seeking to understand it better. You should be going to God and saying, what does this mean? How do I apply this in my life? You should be inviting the Holy Spirit to guide you in your understanding, and you should be contributing to the dialogue around it. So we're announcing another anthology in which we're going to invite people to come with their own interpretation of, the story of Genesis, those first two creation stories, the one that starts in Genesis 1 and the one that starts halfway through Genesis chapter 2, because there are two creation stories. The story of the garden and the tree is actually not the first creation story. It is the second creation story in the Bible. It starts halfway through chapter 2. The first creation story is where God created heaven and earth in 7 days, and every day, the evening and the morning, were the first, the second, the third day. And then he says, and God saw that it was good. And God saw that it was good. And then when he created humans, God saw that it was very good, right? And then he rested on the seventh day. That's the first creation story. And I would submit one more thought here in this little monologue. Hebrews chapter 6 tells us that if we want to have faith, that it is impossible to please God without faith. So if you want to get back to the garden, you want to get back to that state of being with, as you put it, Joe, Paul says, if indeed Paul wrote Hebrews, which many believe he did, that to find favor with God or to know God, you must believe that he is. So you can't force God to prove himself. He won't do it. You have to believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. So to get back to the garden, you have to really want to get to that state of being, and you have to believe that this is good. You have to believe that the creation is good. When God said what he did was good, it was good, it was good, and it was very good. You have to believe that and want to get back to that goodness, Dan. That should appeal to you. Get back to that goodness, right? Get back to that which is good. But there are many different ways to see it. Each of us has sovereignty under the greater and lesser light. Each of us is going to see it a little bit differently. I'd love your take on this, Joe, given what you write about abstract thought. And I haven't finished your book, and I can't wait to continue digging into how you unpack the approach of getting back through the angel, through the flaming sword, to get back to the tree of life and have that communion. Overcome our fear of death. There was a comment here by Jet that suggests that the tree of life referred to a sure knowledge of life after death. The first part of his comment was this: after eating of the knowledge of good and evil, they were barred from eating the tree of life. But at the end of the book of Revelation, it says that Jesus' followers had now eaten of the tree of life. And that suggests that the tree of life referred to a sure knowledge of life after death. So in this analogy, what I would say is, well, they weren't allowed to eat of the tree of life because they had to go through the whole school of hard knocks. They had to gain that knowledge through experience. They had given up the opportunity to take the red pill or the blue pill, the green pill. What is that? What is that Matrix analogy? Right?
Red
or the
pill,
blue,
green
I
pill,
think.
yeah.
Yeah, they took the one pill, so now they couldn't take they couldn't undo it. They had to now go through it all. I'll stop there because, again, I've said way too many mouthfuls. But what are your guys' thoughts of some of the things that I've raised here?
Well, there was a little bit of an epiphany when you'd mentioned about how barbarous this conversation of God versus not God is, right? So you need to believe in God, right? And this is how you get faith, right? This is kind of the concept, right? And I mean, you've heard me say it before about God and good, and it changes things a little bit if you say, well, prove that there's goodness or prove that there's good. It almost obliterates that argument, because if you don't ask good, you only ask God to prove himself, right? Because
Prove to me
it's
that your intentions are pure.
no, the
No,
form,
I'm just saying that's
yeah.
that's a direct, and it's a, you know, if somebody came to you and said, "Prove to me that your intentions are pure," somebody says that to me, my reaction is to raise my middle finger, right? That's how I react to
Your
that
intention.
man, right?
No, but the intentionality isn't what I'm referring to. It's the challenge by, maybe it's an atheist group that would say, prove to me that God exists. And how ridiculous that actually sounds if you actually think about it from an ethical standpoint and say, in an abstract sense, right? The closest we can get to the feeling of goodness would be, by definition, what God represents, right? Okay. You don't say, well, goodness needs to prove something to me. That's ridiculous. It doesn't. That's not how it manifests in the world. We have this ability to understand and participate, as in, I think this would be something that Joe would agree with. Joe's theories and philosophies are very much like participatory, process driven, experiential, and I think there's a lot of value in that. And at the core of what the experience um, is ethical. There's something ethical inside the nature of what it means to be human, right? Is what I would say.
There's certainly a framework. There's certainly some sort of guiding light that I feel like we all have towards, that true north of what is ethical and what isn't, what is good, what isn't. But again, I would hearken back to that whole idea, and I don't use that word lightly, of our interpretation of what good, quote unquote, and evil, quote unquote, actually is. But I do think that there's a lot of value to that golden rule of do unto others, and I think that when you frame the conversation in terms of ethics, I think things kind of break down, because what's potentially good for you and ethical for you is not necessarily true for your neighbor. And when you look at the natural world, no such thing as ethics necessarily exist,
No,
at least in the animal kingdom, or
we're certainly at a point where do unto others as you would have them do unto you does not work in American society today at all.
Yeah, but I think the reason for that, Wade, and it's maybe a different, again, conversation, is that there is no moral compass in the way that there used to be, and I think that moral compass and that true north of an ethical behavior has a value, absolutely, right. However, yet if you wanted to, I think ethics as a theory, philosophically can be weak for exactly what I just stated, is that ethics are not necessarily always universal, because they're frequently circumstantial. However, and again, I think we can all agree that it wouldn't be good to do violence, to someone for no reason, or to impress your will on someone for no reason. But that violence can happen in a lot of different ways. We think of violence as physical, where I frame it again in my work as something that's much more rooted in psychology and in thought itself, within consciousness itself. It's the greatest violence I think we could actually do, is to have an idea that we treat as something real, when it has only an existence within conception itself, within our own minds. So again, but there's a place certainly for ethics, just as there is for religion, just as there is for the things we were talking about before: culture, society, heritage. That gives you an identity, that gives you a jump point But I think it's also potentially something that needs to frequently and constantly be redefined. Everything is a relationship with everything else. And those relationships are frequently, always, I mean, millions, billions of times, potentially per second, being reordered. And Dan, you mentioned process thought. If you know anything about process thought, and I think I mentioned that, I did my PhD work at Claremont Graduate University. Well, if anybody knows anything about Claremont and the theological work that comes out of Claremont, it is the world center for process thought. I never considered myself a process theologian, although I am good friends with a lot of people, and really the godfather of process thought in John Cobb, who is a wonderful, wonderful person, and maybe the smartest person that I've ever encountered, outside of being of far more importance, maybe the kindest person that I've ever encountered, and the most genuine. He's someone that you guys should really talk to and have on the show. But process thought is all about this reordering frequently of the world and one's, not necessarily, it doesn't talk about as much about one's relationship to it. It does in actual events and occasions, but I think as what we're talking about here is how things frequently reshape and reframe themselves based on our own experiences, based on our own interpretations, and our own relationship with the world at large.
Interesting.
Now I said a mouthful, so that seems to be contagious. So.
Well, let's get back then to loaves and fishes and books, right? We have a responsibility to those in our audience who have been putting some of these great comments in there. And Joe, we always give the guest the right to choose a comment. And I don't know if you are familiar enough with the controls in the studio to go look at some of the comments that we did not showcase by clicking on the little chat icon. I think you have access to all of them. We've shared a few of them.
Pick mine, by the way, because I've already ordered your book.
Okay, I don't know where do I see it? Let's see. I see the private chat.
It's off to the right on my screen, my interface, and it's a little chat bubble below music QR codes. But I don't know if you have that same interface.
Yeah,
I think we had this issue earlier with somebody else. I know you have it somewhere, but probably in a slightly different place or way than what I have it.
I see our private chat, or that potential, but I don't see the other one unless I'm like in a full screen. And I should be
there might also be like a toggle button.
That's right. Yeah, I was in the full screen. Maybe I like looking at myself or something while I talk. It's not enough to just hear myself, but oh gosh, there are a lot of comments. So you want me to pick one, huh?
Well, here's a nice one, but yeah, do.
You guys are talking about cats, though. At that time, I have to say,
exactly.
And I'm also going to be biased towards Cameron since he was the one who
probably already got your book.
He's disqualified from getting a book. We appreciate that he was here, but we can't give it to people that work.
How about from Durant and Friends? Because the Atman has been pointed out to me, many times. Is that
you can't? That's me too. That's me.
Oh, that's you too.
Yeah.
Durant and Friends. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yeah. Right. Will Durant. Yeah, the philosopher.
Okay. Gotcha. All right. Well, and it didn't look like it was your picture, but
I know
it's okay. All right. I suppose Meow is out also, as we mentioned.
That's out too.
Yeah.
I gotta stop spamming the chat message.
But Dan, you're also in here as yourself. So
yeah. You know what the tagline for that one is called? Osepitopoli. It's something that Aristotle used to say, and it means more or less, right? And so in all of this relativistic sort of talk, you can actually orient yourself in a direction, and then you have that little asterisk that you can say Osepitopoli. It means more or less, according to Aristotle.
Osepitopoli. All right. Yeah. Very good. Brush up on my Greek. I did like Mr. McLean's comment before. I can't find it now about. There we are. Yeah, the tree of life being the symbol of free will. I think he clearly kind of gets it, right?
Free will is a concept and a topic that we didn't get into at all. I think we've
No,
got to have you back and unpack that. But maybe we go with that one. There, you know, there were a number that I like, but I like that one too, and it's your call anyway.
sure. Let's go with that one.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So Steve McLean, if you're still out there, I'm going to put it in the chat, and it will go out onto our, platforms. But I think we also know how to get in touch with Steve. I think he's a regular viewer that we probably have the email address for. I'll just put it out there, info@soupllc.com, and the Soup team will get a label printed up and the book shipped off to you. To claim your copy. Great. So any last minute thoughts from Dan or Joe that you would like to share as we conclude an hour overtime? But this has been incredibly enlightening for me, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And there's yet so much more to unpack.
Well, let me say something, and then I'll let Joe have the last word. No, I really understood. I really appreciated that explanation of ethics. I come up against this quite often, right? I lean on ethics a little bit, and it dovetails nicely into the wisdom that Wade is explaining about the choice of good versus evil and about how we network and work together. And yet we live in a contemporary world, which again, like what is modernity? But we live in a world where the idea of ethics is very compartmentalized in terms of how to treat people, and doesn't really holistically go into our beings. Right now, there's traditions that push back against that. I'm thinking about the categorical imperative from Immanuel Kant, that I believe it was on his dying deathbed. He says there is good. And it's like, it comes down to, are you a good person? And deriving meaning from ethics, I think, is a little bit stronger than I hate to dismiss it, because ultimately in that Greek sense, good in the form of an ancient Greek ideal is really the culmination of hierarchies, of imagined perfectibility through the virtuous noble man, right? And so you can see how we're kind of getting closer to the big J man there, I guess, and taking this idea of what it means to be a noble man and moving into that person, and that's cultivating things like courage and wisdom and justice, right? And you start asking yourself about all these kinds of things about, well, what is just, what is right and wrong? We're constantly having these conversations with ourselves and within others. It's the superpower that we have as a species, doing what we're doing right now, being able to talk and communicate at a way where you can see the images that I'm verbalizing and vocalizing with my voice. Which are the ones that rise to the top? Well, they're going to be the good ideas, and I put good right at the peak. And so then that's up for us to define, right, and fill out. So
I want to throw in one tiny little thought to what you said, Dan, and then hand it over to you, Joe. And that is that as you talk about justice, it's a thorny word these days, in my opinion, given everybody's perception of justice and the use of justice as a cudgel to beat someone else over the head with. But I would submit, pun intended, that submitting to the light implies whatever you think is just is exposed to the world for consideration, right? The light exposes. Jesus said, We are to be the light of the world. And I often say, not the loudspeaker of the world. The light allows people to form their own opinion without your narrative around it.
I love that, Wade. And Dan, so you're obviously you're lying on Kant's deathbed with him. And the pursuit of the good was the ultimate aim of ancient Greek society, as I understand it, right? But I love the way that's phrased, Wade, because you make decisions, you act, and then those actions, those thoughts, whatever that is exposed to the rest of being and perception to be judged in a way, right? But
What did
I think
Jesus say? They hate the light because their deeds are evil.
Mhm.
Duh.
Right. And again, and I think ultimately, judgment happens, from and to oneself in light of what really is, right? And because I think, and I guess I don't really know, but I have the sense that ultimately we are maybe our own judges, and that if you believe in an all loving deity, that judgment is not as forcible of a thing as sometimes it is spoken about, at least frequently in the Old Testament. And that's where Jesus comes in and says, "No, we're washing that away. We're pressing a reset button on that."
Let he that is without sin cast the first stone.
So again, it comes down to where there has to be a compass, right? There has to be a way by which you navigate through the world, and because you can't just go acting. I mean, you can do all fair in love and war, I suppose, right?
I'm sorry, I got to throw out one of my favorite sayings that I myself came up with. If you can't be a good example, you can at least serve as a horrifying warning.
I love that. Also, that is wonderful. I will steal that, I think, from you.
So again, getting back to the light, it just shows nobody else needs to judge you, but they can say, man, I ain't doing that.
Right. But there, and again, I think if you have an idea about how you're supposed to tread within the world, and how you're comfortable living, I mean, there are, I suppose, folks with psychological disorder, sociopaths out there that have no problem acting, however they want to. And so where does ethics live there ultimately, for them, and how does that play a role for that sort of contract with the world, for that sort of relationship with the world? But I think for so many of us, that there is, as Dan was saying, like there's something that you draw from, and really can not only just from from your own self benefit from, but others benefit from that pursuit as well. And I think largely because we are all striving to be better to one another, to have a better relationship with ourselves and the world. And I think if that's the aim, then that really is what potentially the good is. That might take many different manifests, but I think you could ultimately make an argument that that's really where we're trying to drive this.
Wonderful. Well, exactly double your value tonight. Thank you so much, Joe, i.e. we went a whole hour overtime. Joe, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Dan, thank you so much for all your contributions. Thank you to the wonderful audience with all your comments. Please do subscribe, share the news about this show. We will have Joe back soon. Next week, we have Larry Lundstrom, a pastor who will be talking about forgiveness or punishment. When Jesus commanded forgiveness, he continued to uphold government authority, saying that they wield the sword and have the right to imprison. How do we reconcile forgiveness with a society that punishes? Is that the way it's meant to be? Have we understood the writings and the sayings of Jesus around forgiveness properly, it actually gets back into this judgment, right? Thou shalt not judge, and let him that is without sin cast the first stone. And yet other parables say, hey, if you can't make peace with your brother, you're going to be thrown in jail, right? So what is the role? This gets back to sort of the subtext of this show. What is the role of religion in society, and how does it inform our judicial system, our civil laws, and the management thereof? So please tune in next week to hear from Larry Lundstrom. And Joe, we will definitely have you back as soon as you're available. But in the meantime, I'm noodling around on a closing statement that we can use every show, because what are we here, episode 64, and I still haven't figured out how to actually close the show, but I'm leaning now towards some version of it's been great being with you tonight.
Being with you, exactly. Yep, we know what that means. We'll let the audience figure it out, hopefully, if they read the book. So
awesome, thank you so much, and please continue to subscribe, share the news, and let's grow this audience and this discussion and your participation. Looking forward to being with you again next week, same time, same place.